of Central Florida, you're listening to the most electrifying show in media, A Neighbor's Choice. I'm your host, your neighbor, David Gornoski. So glad to be with you. And I wanted to start off our program by mentioning Oakley Transport. Oakley Transport is looking for drivers, qualified CDLA licensed drivers to hit the road to keep America fed. They've got top over-the-road driving professionals earning up to $140,000 plus. Regional driving professionals earning up to $115,000. They've got open positions now. Check them out at oakleytransport.com. They have a big emphasis also on trying to make sure they can find great opportunities for veterans especially. They love to support veterans, so go to oakleytransport.com. And speaking of veterans, I'm joined now by a great figure for understanding military strategy, understanding foreign affairs, someone who's not going to be giving us the same old watered-down talking points from the D.C. Think tank crowd. We have with us Colonel Doug McGregor. How you doing, sir?
Yeah, fine. I'm on the road in Virginia, so we have some hills and mountains here.
Okay, well, no problem. I just wanted to have you on again because we haven't talked to you in a while to get an update on kind of how you see. Now, the last time I talked to you, you were talking about how you felt there was going to be a big, and maybe I am misstating this, but a big Russian kind of surge when the winter came, but it's a little bit different, right? What happened here since we've last spoken that kind of has unfolded as you see it?
Well, you're still going to see massive offensives, but one of the things that has always been a stumbling block is freezing the ground. Northern Ukraine froze pretty quickly, but southern Ukraine, until about 5 days ago, had not consistently dropped below freezing during the day. As a result, you still had standing water in places like Bakhmut or Kherson and other areas of southern Ukraine. That's now ended. So you have frozen ground across Ukraine at the moment, and they usually like to have 2 weeks of a deep freeze in the ground to provide for the best trafficability for all kinds of equipment. So I think that problem has been solved. In the meantime, the Russians have pressed ahead persistently and consistently against the Ukrainians, especially in the area around Bakhmut. Bakhmut has turned into a huge bonanza for the Russians and a tremendous bloodbath for the Ukrainians. They've had roughly 14, 15 brigades, Ukrainian brigades of 4,000 men in Bakhmut, and they have all now been withdrawn with the exception of 2 or 3, and they've lost 70% of their strength. So just so your listeners understand what that means, when you lose 70% of a 4,000-man brigade, you're talking roughly 2,800 men killed or wounded, which means that what remains is battalion strength and not very capable. So that's the situation in Bakhmut. In the meantime, the towns around Bakhmut to its north, east, and west have begun to crumble. And Soledar, a very important town, which is a suburb, if you will, from Bakhmut, has now fallen to the Russians. So I think the position in Bakhmut is very tenuous, and I would expect that to fall very, very shortly. Now, why is that important? Well, it's a transportation hub. It's a logistical hub. It's the linchpin strategically for the entire defense of southern Ukraine by the Ukrainians in the Donbass. And that is going to now crumble, I think, over the next 2 to 3 weeks. The real question for the theater commander, General Surovikin, is how he wants to proceed. He's got roughly 100,000 combat troops. That means people that actually move and fight in Belarusia, another 100,000 just east of Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, and then another 80 to 90,000 behind the thousands that he has in the lines defending southern Ukraine. So he has the potential for a three-pronged assault. The question is, when does he do it and how does he do it? That could happen tomorrow morning. It could wait for another 2 weeks. We'll have to see. But I think he's going to be inclined to exploit the disintegration of the Ukrainian defense in southern Ukraine. And the problem for the Ukrainians is once that crumbles where they are in the south, they end up on open, rolling terrain that's very difficult to defend. They're talking about falling back to Kramatorsk, for your listeners if they want to look at the map. But Kramatorsk is barely defensible. Beyond Kramatorsk, it's just frankly flat and open, which is ideal for the Russians, who now have close to 2,000 of their best and newest tanks, plus another 3,000 or 4,000 infantry fighting vehicles, several thousand rocket artillery systems, and tactical ballistic missiles. So they're ready to go. It's a call for the theater commander.
Yeah. So I thought that the Ukraine was saying that the Russians were moving away from Bakhmut, but now they're coming back in. Is this what's the strategy that we see here?
Well, Bakhmut itself is surrounded on three sides. They've left one side open for the damaged Ukrainian units to pull out.
Okay.
In the meantime, they've turned on the surrounding towns, which have fallen, making the position that the Ukrainians hold in Bakhmut essentially untenable. And that's why the other problem with Bakhmut for the Ukrainians is that they were trying to build up reserves for a potential assault further south on Kherson. Those reserves have been lost now in Bakhmut. So the Ukrainians are probably down to maybe a total of 140, 150,000 troops that are effective. That is, combat soldiers that are trained and capable of fighting. They've lost most of their officers and NCOs, and so the new formations they're trying to build are filled with untrained recruits. And most of the equipment that we're promising to send to the Ukrainians won't arrive for months. Large quantities of it have to be repaired and refurbished before they're sent. And the numbers are just inadequate. For instance, they're talking about sending 50, 60 Bradley fighting vehicles. Well, first of all, they've got to refurbish these things because we are actually short on Bradley holes as a result of the last 20 years. Secondly, you've got to train people to operate the weapon systems. You have the 25-millimeter chain gun plus a tow missile system. Those are complex systems, and they're not easy to keep up. They're very maintenance-intensive. So even if that stuff arrives, it won't get there for 3, 4, 5 months. And I'll be frank with you, I'd be very surprised if anything is happening in Ukraine at that point.
So when you see a lot of these different, I'm looking at some of the headlines that caught my attention from of course, the corporate press. France is sending tank-killing AMX 10RC armored vehicles to Ukraine. That's Business Insider. News Yahoo says Kremlin says new Western armored vehicles for Ukraine will deepen suffering.
Well, they're right. They're going to prolong, potentially, depending upon what happens over the next few weeks. They could prolong the misery and suffering in Ukraine. There's no question about that. But, you were talking about this AMX vehicle that has a 105-millimeter tank gun on it. That's the tank gun that we utilized in the United States Army 30, 40 years ago when I first came in the Army in 1977. That's an old piece of equipment. It also sits on wheels, and anything wheeled in that part of the world has great difficulty moving off the roads. And the Ukrainians desperately need vehicles that they can use off-road. So, I think people are giving this stuff a big buildup, but quite frankly, none of it's significant. The Germans, in the meantime, and we have both said we're not sending in our tanks. In other words, we're not going to try and move M1A1 series tanks into Ukraine, and the Germans are not going to send Leopard tanks to Ukraine. And again, these are complex systems. You need a lot of time to learn how to maintain them, and they're maintenance intensive. You have to have a developed infrastructure in the theater of people and equipment and mechanics to keep these things running. So the bottom line is, I think we're looking at potentially a war termination exercise over the next month, depending upon what Surovikin decides to do. And again, the danger in my mind is that once it becomes clear that everything east of the Dnieper has collapsed, the Russians will have to eliminate whatever Ukrainian forces exist on the west side of the Dnieper, and they will have to eliminate this Zelensky regime. As long as the Zelensky regime is there, it's going to present a permanent danger to Russian national security. That means they will have to cross into Western Ukraine to finish the job. And I think that's one of the reasons they're holding back on it's probably about 150 to 175,000 troops up in Belarusia, but about 100,000 that would then move on an operational axis from north to south into central Ukraine. I think they're probably going to hold up on that and see what we do, because the great danger is that as we watch the Ukrainian forces collapse in essentially battles of annihilation over the next few weeks, there'll be a temptation in Washington to say, well, let's send the U.S. and Polish forces in Poland into Western Ukraine to create some sort of safe area, or worse yet, try to rescue this criminal Zelensky regime from destruction. If that happens, then of course all bets are off. We may find ourselves confronting the Russians directly, and that will not be pretty. We're not really prepared for that.
What does that mean, that we would confront the Russians directly? Would that mean, talking about some of the Americans that are on the ground now, coming into direct
conflict? The Americans that are on the ground surreptitiously or secretly operating either as contractors or under some other subterfuge, they're at great risk over the next 4 weeks of being killed anyway. I'm talking about the Americans who are sitting in Poland, who are organized into these armored brigades and the 101st Light Infantry formations. If they send those in to fight, which is what they will have to do if they go into Ukraine, they're going to meet the Russians. And the Russians are now far, far stronger, better equipped, better trained, better led than they have ever been. I mean, this is what people don't understand. At the beginning of this whole thing, on 24th of February, the Russians treated this as essentially stop and go, move a little distance, stop, see if we'll negotiate, come to a conclusion. And they wasted 3 months on that nonsense, and they finally stopped and said, all right, now we're going to fight a real war. And what you're about to witness are large-scale offensives that equate to high-end conventional warfare, massively destructive, extraordinarily lethal. And that's an environment that we in the West have not seen, certainly not since 1945 in Europe.
Wow. And what do you think is going to be the inciting incident that the American forces would say, okay, we're going to have a direct confrontation here? I
don't know. I really don't know, because I don't know what Mr. Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and his staff are thinking. I don't know what's in the back of the mind of somebody like Secretary Austin. I don't know what Blinken is thinking. I don't know what the major figures that we do not see in public, whether it's Susan Rice or Samantha Power or somebody like that. I don't know what's going on in their minds. I mean, my view is we have no business involving ourselves in this. We've made this far, far worse than it needed to be. The Ukrainians have died by the thousands needlessly. We need to get out of this, and what we should be doing is trying to facilitate an end to the conflict. But we keep making it clear that we're going to fight until the last Ukrainian is dead, because we will not concede anything to the Russians. And if you're not going to concede what they wanted to begin with, which was actually quite modest, they were simply interested in the two breakaway republics enjoying equality before the law and political autonomy. They wanted recognition of their control as legitimate of the Crimean Peninsula, which has always been Russian, never, strictly speaking, Ukrainian. And finally, they wanted neutrality for Ukraine. Well, if we'd agreed to those, then there would be hundreds of thousands of able-bodied living Ukrainians. Right now, we think that the Ukrainians have lost at least 150,000 dead. The Ukrainian ambassador to the United States was quoted in Time magazine, where he let it slip out that whole cities are destroyed. They're losing thousands of men every day, and they are losing people. They don't even know where they are or what's happened to them. He painted a very grim picture, and then I think when he realized he'd gone too far, he shut up and changed the subject. Very much like von der Leyen, the president of the EU, who admitted that over 100,000 Ukrainians had been killed, and that was over a month ago. And the losses for the Ukrainians have simply gotten worse. And when you are losing a war, when you are losing battles, and you are forced to retreat, to withdraw, to fall back, that's when you take your heaviest losses. If you look at every major war, look at the American Civil War, The losses that were taken during the last year of the Civil War by the South were horrendous. They were horrific. They were bad on the northern side, but of course the South was bled white and couldn't replace their losses. You have a similar situation with Ukrainians. The Germans took most of their heaviest losses in the last eight months of World War II. And that's what we're seeing right now in Ukraine. The losses are mounting every day. It's horrific. It should stop. But no one in Washington is willing to admit that they've lost. And they have lost. And Ukraine will be destroyed as a result of this stupidity. No one wants to step forward and say, we made a mistake, let's halt this. That's the problem, David.
Right. Nobody wants to take responsibility for their part of contributing to this destruction. Is it your opinion that Washington wants a direct conflict with Russia in this?
Well, I don't know if I would say Washington. I think you have a majority of Republicans and Democrats sitting in the Senate and the House that have no idea what real war looks like. They have this bizarre notion that war resembles the tiny battles that were fought from time to time over the last 20 years. When I say tiny, I'm talking about the truth that we always dominated our insurgent opponents in Iraq or in Afghanistan from the air and from the ground with overwhelming firepower. There was never an organized force to fight us. We haven't had a major enemy per se to fight us since 1991. And even though the Arabs in 1991 were well equipped and certainly capable, they were not efficiently or effectively commanded. And again, they couldn't cope with the massive, accurate, devastating firepower that we have. The situation now is quite similar in Ukraine. Ukrainians can't cope with this. And as a result, they're on the ropes, to be frank. But we won't let up. And I think people in Washington don't understand what confronting the Russians militarily for us would mean.
And it seems like you look at the news headlines, and of course there's a lot of propaganda. The British media, of course, and we've talked about this before, is even more insanely bloodthirsty and warmongering in its hysteria than even the American media, which is saying something. But is it just that they're? I don't understand how nobody in that whole power network is saying this isn't going to look good for us if we continue to double down on the hot war, and these calls for regime change with Russia is not going to come out looking in a more pro-Western direction. It'll probably be more hawkish, more extreme in terms of the nationalist wing of the Russian political sphere, right?
Well, I think the Russians are enraged at us because they do not understand or comprehend the hatred that seems to animate and motivate us. The Russians are not our blood enemies. And frankly, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia presented no appreciable threat to us whatsoever. And the Russians, their nuclear weapons and capability is substantial, but they were the ones that initiated and pushed arms control. We decided we didn't like what they were doing or what they were interpreting. They decided that they didn't like what we were doing in Romania, for instance, with the theater ballistic missile early warning systems and anti-ballistic missile defense systems. But we would not allow them to inspect. We treated them as though they had no right to say anything about what we did in Eastern Europe. And of course, all of this against the backdrop of having promised everybody from Gorbachev to Putin over the last 30 years that we were not going to push our forces east. We were not going to push our forces up to the borders of Russia. From their vantage point, they feel betrayed. They know that we built the army in Ukraine, that we cultivated the hatred against them in Ukraine and pushed the Ukrainians to attack them. And quite frankly, the Ukrainians were in the position of rapidly attacking Russia before the Russians attacked them. They were surprised that the Russians came in when they did, and the Russians subsequently decided, thank God they did, because this army was extremely well trained and well equipped and dangerous and lethal, much more than they thought, and they realized that this was being directed at them. I mean, we could talk for hours on this. The problem now is we're way beyond that. We're now talking about a situation where the Russians have said, our country is at risk. This is an existential fight for us. We will not tolerate a regime in Kiev. We will not tolerate Ukrainian forces in Ukraine that are hostile to us and will threaten us. And we don't seem to get it. We need to stay out of this, because if we get involved in this any more beyond what we've already done, it could lead to a confrontation with Russia. I don't think people in Washington understand what that means.
Colonel Douglas McGregor, I always appreciate your thoughts. Thank you for sharing us with this time.
Okay, thank you, David. Bye-bye.
You can email me hello@aneighborschoice.com. Back in just a moment.